Snow lashed against the cabin walls like claws from a restless spirit. The wind howled through the gaps in the shutters, and the fire inside crackled with a tired hiss, its embers fighting against the cold creeping in. John Maddox sat at his rough-hewn table, staring at a tin cup of lukewarm coffee. He hadn't spoken a word aloud in days. Since his wife, Clara, passed the spring before, grief had settled into his bones like the winter itself, quiet, heavy, always there. The knock came so faintly he almost thought it was the wind. He froze, listening. Then it came again, not the groan of a tree branch or the battering of snow, but deliberate, timid, desperate. He stood slowly, every joint stiff. His rifle came off the wall with the instinct of a man who had lived too long in uncertain country. With cautious steps, he unbarred the door and cracked it open. A shape collapsed forward. He caught her before she hit the floor. She was light as a sack of flour, more bones than flesh, and cold as the snow falling around her. A girl, no more than 17, with dark braids matted to her cheeks and a blood-streaked buckskin dress torn at the seams. Her face was raw with windburn, lips cracked, and her eyes, half-lidded and glassy, darted up to his with something between terror and relief. "Jesus," he muttered, easing her inside. He shut the door against the wind and set her down near the hearth. Stripping off his coat, he wrapped it around her shoulders and stoked the fire with fresh wood. She flinched at every movement, eyes flicking to the rifle leaning against the wall. She didn't speak, didn't beg, didn't cry. She just breathed shallow and stared at him like a cornered doe. John grabbed a clean cloth, dipped it in warmed water, and began wiping the blood from her forehead. A cut, shallow but fresh, ran along her hairline. Her hands, clutching the coat tightly, were raw and blistered. He ladled out a bowl of stew, mostly beans and jerky, and offered it wordlessly. She sniffed it, hesitated, then took it with trembling fingers. She ate like someone who hadn't tasted food in days. He watched, questions burning behind his lips. But none came out, not yet. Later, as the storm howled louder, he pulled a blanket from the trunk and laid it over her slight frame. She was already asleep, curled like a child beside the fire. He watched her for a long time before settling onto his cot, eyes on the dancing shadows along the walls. His rifle stayed within arm's reach, not because he feared her, but because he had a gut feeling. Someone might come looking. The morning broke gray and still, a thin veil of mist rising off the snow-covered prairie. Inside the cabin, the fire had dwindled to soft coals. John stirred from his cot, the blanket falling away as he sat up slowly, joints popping. For a moment, he wasn't sure where he was, then he saw her. The girl was already awake, sitting cross-legged by the fire, cradling the tin cup he'd left out. Her eyes tracked him silently. No words, just a slight nod. Something about her seemed changed, less afraid, more ready. He gave a quiet grunt of acknowledgement, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside with his axe to split wood. The cold slapped him immediately. He took a few steps toward the chopping stump and froze mid-stride. There, on the ridge above the cabin, were riders. Dozens of them, silent, still. John's breath caught. His hand dropped instinctively to his side, though he carried no weapon. On the far edge of the ridge, more figures emerged. The snow, once pristine, now bore the dark silhouettes of horses and men, feathers in their hair, lances in their hands, the gleam of steel and bone. They were surrounding him. John turned slowly, scanning the hills. It wasn't just a few scouts. This was a war party. He counted quickly. 10, 20, no, more. At least 70 riders, all Comanche. He stood still as stone, every instinct telling him to run, to hide, to raise his rifle, but he didn't. There was nowhere to run. No one would come to help. And he'd already made his choice when he opened that door the night before. From among the riders, one broke away. A tall man astride a paint stallion, his face painted in ochre and black, long hair braided with beads and strips of cloth. A bear claw necklace swung from his chest, and a lance tipped with obsidian gleamed in his hand. He stopped a dozen yards away, staring down at John with unreadable eyes. Behind John, the cabin door creaked open. The girl stepped out barefoot into the snow, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Her face, once pale with fear, now burned with something else, recognition. Her eyes locked on the man before her, and for a moment, the world held its breath. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. Then another. John watched her pass him without a word. She didn't look back. She walked to the man on the stallion and fell to her knees in the snow. Her head bowed. She spoke in Comanche. Words John didn't understand, but the tone was clear. Pain, apology, relief. The man dismounted, dropping the lance into the snow. He knelt before her, gripping her shoulders, then pulled her into a fierce embrace. He said something low, something that brought tears to her eyes. John looked around. The warriors had not lowered their weapons. Not yet. The man, clearly a chief, stood and turned to face John. There was no smile, no visible warmth. Just silence. A long, measured moment passed between them. John didn't flinch, didn't step back. Then the chief lifted his hand and gave a short signal. One by one, the warriors began to dismount. Some led their horses forward. Others began to gather in a wide circle around the cabin, not in threat, but in ceremony. Something had shifted. The girl, Nokoma, stood between the two men, her eyes flicking from one to the other. She spoke again, softer this time. Then the chief walked slowly toward John. When they stood face to face, close enough to see the windburn on each other's skin, the chief reached into a pouch at his waist and pulled something out. A necklace, feathers, beads, and a small carved piece of bone shaped like a hawk. He held it out to John. No words were exchanged. None were needed. John took it in his calloused hands. And in that moment, the snow fell silent. A fire crackled in the center of the open field, just beyond the cabin. The wind had eased, and the snow had stopped falling, leaving the earth soft and quiet underfoot. Smoke rose into the pale blue sky, curling above the gathering of Comanche warriors who now sat in a wide circle around the flames. Horses stood tethered nearby, stamping and snorting clouds into the air, their riders resting, speaking in low voices or watching the horizon. John sat cross-legged on a blanket near the edge of the circle, the feathered necklace still resting in his palm. It felt strange there, foreign but not unwelcome. Across the fire sat the Comanche chief, his face painted in streaks of ash and red. He had introduced himself earlier in quiet tones through Nokoma, whose voice was careful and reverent when she spoke his name, Tasunka. Nokoma now sat between them, her posture straight and composed, but her eyes flicked from John to her father, measuring every look and gesture. She had shed the blanket and now wore a soft deerskin cloak embroidered with beads and quillwork. Someone had brought it for her when she was recognized. Her hair was freshly braided, her hands cleaned and treated with salve. She looked nothing like the half-frozen girl who had collapsed in John's arms just the night before. Still, when she looked at him, it was with quiet gratitude, and something deeper. She turned to her father and spoke in Comanche, the language flowing like wind over stone. Her voice was steady, but John could feel the emotion behind her words. Tasunka listened without interruption, nodding once or twice, his expression unreadable. When she finished, she looked back to John and spoke, slowly, carefully. I tell him, you found me. You gave food. You did not hurt me. You made no threat. John nodded slightly. Wasn't gonna. That's not the kind of man I am. She translated, then added more of her own. Her father listened, then stood. He circled the fire and came to stand before John again. You protect my blood, he said in thick, deliberate English. You could have left her. Or worse, you did not. John stood too, slow and respectful, unsure what to say. The two men stared at each other in silence. Tasunka reached forward and placed a calloused hand on John's shoulder. You have strong heart. Not weak with fear. John gave a slow nod. Wasn't about courage, just what was right. Tasunka said something in Comanche to the others, a short phrase sharp with finality. Nokoma didn't translate, but the reaction was immediate. Several of the warriors nodded. A few approached with solemn expressions and nodded at John as they passed. One of them offered him a carved pipe, which he took, puffed once, and returned. Tasunka turned again to Nokoma and spoke more softly this time. She responded, her voice quivering just a little now. Then, slowly, Tasunka took a step back. You are friend to my family now, he said to John. That does not end. Not in snow. Not in war. John felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He wasn't sure what it meant, not entirely, but he felt it was real. Thank you, he said simply. Tasunka turned to his daughter. You stay. She nodded once. Yes. No protest. No further words. The chief gave a single, heavy nod, then stepped back into the circle. The others followed, gathering their gear, mounting up. One by one, the Comanche began to ride out in silence, leaving only the fading fire behind. John and Nokoma stood side by side, watching the last of them disappear over the ridge. Only then did she speak again. I did not think I would live, she whispered. I think, maybe I was meant to find your door. John looked at her and gave a slow breath. Maybe, he said, you were. And in the silence that followed, nothing needed to be explained. The days that followed moved slowly, as if the world itself had decided to exhale. Snow still clung to the earth in patches, and the wind still whispered across the prairie, but the cabin, once cold and empty, felt changed. Alive, in some quiet, subtle way. John had gone back to his routines, chopping wood in the morning, tending to the fire, keeping the small homestead running as he always had. But now, there was a second set of hands. Nokoma rose before dawn, her footsteps soft but certain. She moved with a quiet grace, gathering water, tending the embers, preparing food from what little they had. She didn't ask questions, and neither did he. They worked side by side, exchanging only what needed saying. But it was in the silence that something deeper grew. One afternoon, the snow began to melt in earnest. The sun peeked through pale clouds, casting golden light across the cabin's roof. John was repairing a section of fencing that had collapsed beneath the weight of the last storm. He drove another stake into the ground when he felt her presence beside him. Nokoma had brought water and leaned quietly against a post, her hair tucked back in a single braid, her shawl fluttering gently in the breeze. You fix things, she said, her voice soft. He glanced at her, then gave a half smile. That's the hope. She nodded, her gaze drifting over the prairie. It is good to fix. Even when things are broken a long time. John paused, his hands resting on the post. He thought of his wife, gone 2 winters now. Of the empty house. Of the long, cold nights. He didn't speak for a while. It's hard, he said finally. Losing someone. Nokoma didn't look at him, but her voice was steady. I lost many. Some to sickness. Some to war. Some, because they chose the wrong path. He nodded. So did I. Maybe not the same way, but enough. A long silence stretched between them. Wind stirred the dry grass. A hawk circled far above, its shadow gliding over the field like a memory. Nokoma turned to him. My people, we say love is not just feeling. It is survival, sharing the fire, standing when the storm comes. John looked at her then. Really looked. The lines of her face, the strength behind her eyes. The way she didn't flinch from his gaze. I don't know what I can offer, he said. My land, my hands, my word. But I ain't a young man anymore. She stepped closer. You offer what matters. You opened your door. You did not run. There was a warmth in her words, one he hadn't let himself feel in years. It scared him a little, but he didn't turn away. That night, they sat at the hearth, the fire casting flickering shadows against the log walls. He played a quiet tune on the harmonica, something he hadn't touched since before his wife's death. Nokoma sat across from him, listening with eyes half closed, her hands resting in her lap. When he finished, she smiled softly. My father said your heart was strong. He was right. He looked into the flames, then back at her. I think, he said slowly, we both walked out of something dark. And maybe we were meant to find each other on the other side of it. Nokoma stood, crossed the room, and knelt beside him. She placed her hand over his. Together, they sat in the glow of the fire. 2 souls, battered by time and loss, but no longer alone. Not anymore. Outside, the snow continued to melt, and somewhere in the dark, spring was beginning to stir.